Welcome to Payne on Politics, a podcast where host Dr. Gregory Payne of Emerson College sits down with fellow experts to discuss the current state of politics, public opinion, and global affairs. In a world growing increasingly complex, communication and critical thinking is key. This only makes the Emerson motto, expression necessary to evolution, more true.
Center and also the Chair of Communication Studies at Emerson College for another Payne on Politics. We're here today to talk to Pete Hall, who is an alum at Emerson and has been in various positions here. He's a big advocate. He was someone who helped start the SportsCom program. And we're here, though, not to necessarily talk about that, but Pete, we had an icon who passed away, someone who's really been, I would say, the mantra of the 60s in terms of Ohio. Can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts in terms of David Crosby passing away?
Yeah, so thanks for bringing me in here today, bringing me back to Emerson.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, so I know with the passing of David Crosby, all of us that are interested in kind of the protest rhetoric, music, culture of the 60s and 70s, really see him as an iconic figure, someone who, various events that you look at in the 60s, he was right there to respond to them through music. And I think, and you can tell us, I wasn't born during that time. I'm just more or less a student of the era. I'm not an expert on it by any means, but I do enjoy that music over some of the music of today, which I feel doesn't necessarily resonate with politics, culture, things that occurred as it did back then. So, how was David Crosby perceived in the 60s? I know he was with the Byrds. I know he had made some comments about the Kennedy assassinations, also released the song after RFK was assassinated in 1968. Being there during that time, how was that, environment of political songs based upon the events that went on?
Well, I think from my perspective, I'm teaching, as you know, a course on Kent State, Jackson State, and I have, roughly 20 kids, of course, did not know anything about the period. Unfortunately, just due to the American education system, most of them didn't know much about Kent State. Many know nothing about Jackson State. But I think growing up in that period, of course, the 50s, you had people like Pat Boone, you had people like Tab Hunter singing things like, April Love, and nothing very political. Of course, it was the same period as President Eisenhower. And when you got to the 60s, of course, with Elvis and others, you had music as, I would say, a good weapon in terms of the establishment. And when you look at, I think Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, as you've said, various tributaries for various other groups coming together to just have what I think was one of the most iconic groups. To me, when you look at the 60s, whether it be in the early part with John Kennedy, and of course they're watching JFK, and the piece, art, media, songs, music are such a dynamic part. And I think when you and I were talking earlier, paying tribute to not just Crosby, but to that period, we talked about exactly what it took to make this song and the sort of the message behind it. Now, you brought in a Life magazine, which was part of traditional media.
And I think, as we look at kind of the song Ohio, I know for me it brings some emotion to me because being from Ohio, I have family from Kent. I have a personal relationship with Kent as a city, understand through my family. My parents went to Kent State. My grandfather was friends with Governor Rhodes. So, I have some connection with that. That song that really more or less, makes the Kent State tragedy timeless. It pops on the radio. You're like, oh, wow. You knew
immediately where you were.
Yeah.
The one thing I would add is, as you know, because we've talked about it, when VH1 did the 70s, they contacted me to talk about the historical aspects. So I was with Alan Canfora. Of course, we miss Alan. He passed away. But I think we all said that, and what I found intriguing there were 2 or 3 people who'd gone to Vietnam, veterans, and their response was, they said, well, what do you think when you hear that song? Because 10 soldiers and Nixon's coming. 2 of them said, every time I hear that song, I cry. because I realized how many people died in a war that was absolutely for no cause. So I think whether you were for the war, against the war, whatever, it's a song where you suddenly just reflect, you're sort of dead in your tracks, no pun intended, and you it really still emotionally involves me today.
And I think, that's how Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Young at the time, they said in the interviews, they were so overcome with emotion because I think it was Graham Nash who said, like, we're killing our children. We're killing our own children. And, David Crosby and Neil Young were doing their thing in a cabin in the woods in Northern California, and they saw this Life magazine. They knew that the tragedy had occurred. Life magazine, I have a version here, which has some of the photos, and this was like the first look to the American people of like what happened. It brought it to life. So,
of course, we have the photo in my office. We're going to have John Philo and Mary Vecchio, but here is Mary Vecchio, but here you have Sergeant Pryor,
full spread.
Yes,
and then here's Alan Camphora waving the flag.
And the guard kneeling, which goes against any type of Army procedure, kneeling in the practice football field.
And it was interesting how Life, positioned this. It was Nixon in a crisis of leadership, and then it goes right into the Kent State, as
at high noon
an event. And it goes through these photos. Then we get into, it's interesting, the most iconic photo was not published in this version. It was more of like a, here's what happened, here's what happened, here's what happened.
Yes.
And then also, it goes into, after that, the tragedy, but then it brings the story of Bill Schroeder, kind of how he was this all-American kid. So that's the approach that's taken from this Life magazine, which is May 15th, 1970. So you're looking, 10, 11 days after it occurred, which May 15th, what happened that day? Oh, that's when the Jackson State shootings occurred and 2 students were killed.
Right.
So kind of ironic that all that happened. And then that was the same day also that Neil Young went out into the woods, came back, said, I wrote a song, and that's how Ohio was created. I know when you look at it at the times, this was not the era of, I'm going to record something on my phone. It's out on the internet immediately. I'm going to do a quick, TikTok song, and have it be publicized. They had to go record it. They had to get it printed on vinyl. It had to be released. Masters get sent out by mail to the radio stations, and they did a very quick turnaround, and it hit the airwaves very quickly, and it was also banned on a lot of AM stations.
Yes.
I know Alan Camphora even said, it was amazing how quickly he went from being there at Kent to driving down the road, maybe like a month later, and like hearing on the station like the song Ohio, and he would talk about that experience. And I know David Crosby also, when he attended some of the commemorations and anniversaries at Kent, he would talk about that as well, as one of the most meaningful moments in kind of his career. It really hit like a pinnacle at that point, because they were using names. They said Nixon. They were
Tin soldiers.
They were right into it directly, and kind of taking on that establishment from their perspective. So,
well, I think the simplicity of it, tin soldiers and Nixon's coming. We're finally on our own. This summer we heard the drumming, 4 dead in Ohio. It was a point where, as many people have said, that. And Mary Vecchio and John Philo, when they met at Emerson for the first time in 1995, said that John said, I think I trapped you in the photo. He had not met with her, both crying. And she said, we were part of God's plan. And her thought was, and I think she's correct, that this photo and that song helped in the war because Americans believed finally we're now in Ohio killing our kids. Now, the one thing I'd like to say to people listening is people go, well, you talk a lot about Kent State and you've got Jackson State, but you don't talk as much about Jackson State. And we've always talked about Jackson State. Gene Young, who many of you will remember, came and was there at Jackson State. Unfortunately, he's passed away. But the one thing I would like for people to think about, with Jackson State, there was an immediate, this was Jackson, Mississippi, you had young people killed at Jackson, but there was an immediate investigation, even in Mississippi. Mm-hmm. It took 4 years with Ted Kennedy threatening Nixon with a full congressional inquiry, and this was with Watergate brewing, before they would even open up an investigation at Kent. So that's why I think people like Crosby, people like others, including myself, think that there's much more to what occurred at Kent State than we've ever found out, and that's why we continue to pursue justice.
Yeah, and I think, the Jackson State component and to Kent State, I think we look at that as kind of more or less one event. And I think when you look at that as one event, you can really kind of unpack more or less what was actually occurring at the time. I know, this song, Ohio, written by four white men, there was also reactions from Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy. When you get into race relations in the U.S., Chicago riots, 1968, we look at like other music that was influential at the times. You look at Motown, what's one of the most, the most popular songs from like that era from Motown? Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, a story of a Vietnam soldier that comes back. That was his, in 1971, ode to that time and place. I think also it's very interesting, Motown was always ahead of the curve and trying to push the envelope in terms of, social advocacy, moving acceptance, that type of thing. And the song War by Edwin Starr was actually released also on May 15th, 1970, which was the day that Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young wrote Ohio, the day that the Life magazine went out, and the day that the Jackson State shootings were happening. So that kind of May 15th, 1970, Motown releases War. There's whether the planets were in some alignment during that, but there was a lot going on at that time. So,
well, I think, as you said, if you lived in that area, you realized that the establishment was being attacked not only with music, art, also fashion. There were ways when you were, of course, women, the women's movement with Bella Abzug and Shirley Chisholm, and, traditional as well as not so traditional, burn your bras, going to really not do anything in terms of pressing for women's rights. That was very, very important. I think the one thing to also consider when you're thinking of the music, think of Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix had been to Vietnam, and he comes back and he does his very powerful rendition of the Star Spangled Banner, where it's actually dropping bombs in Vietnam, and people were horrified by that. And we've continued to see with Jose Feliciano, even post the 70s, when he did his rendition of the Star Spangled Banner, which had more of a Hispanic, Latina tone, people were outraged at that. So music has always been, I think, a very, very important piece. And this is why, as we've said, this is kind of an iconic piece. I think for those listening, think of your favorite song of that era, and you're going to see that there's going to be certainly a political piece to it.
Yeah, and I think, that's really interesting that you bring that up, about every era and there's the music with it. Not being like a music historian, but just someone who like enjoys listening to music. You can really look at events. You say, okay, so 9/11, what music was from 9/11? What music influenced that? You look at things like the U2s, in the 80s. You look at 80s, 90s. You look at, the culture of events and how music, how art, how, photography influences that. So.
See, to me, and maybe it's because I'm growing up and I'm partial and biased, but I think the 60s is really the sort of mother lode for music, because right now I don't really connect a lot of the music with protest, and maybe we're using other types of social media. But getting back to your roots, when you think of Kent, you have people, and I know when we did the VH1 piece, Chrissy Hine from The Pretenders was there, and she was saying that she remembers, and she talks about Jeff Miller just going to class, and suddenly, he was exercising his right to protest. Nick Saban, somebody we spoke to, very successful coach of the Alabama Crimson Tide, is adamant in his views about the fact that these kids were murdered that day, and that we need to learn from it. So I think the one thing that still strikes me is, even today, 53 years later, maybe it's not 11%, because only 11% blame the guard, but a sizable number of Americans still think that those people who were there at Kent deserved what they got. I mean, you live in Kent. I mean,
and it's interesting that you bring that up, because I know, Kent State was a huge piece of Ken Burns' documentary Vietnam.
Right.
And I think a lot of, like, in modern day, we look at, these leaders of, how we're receiving our information, and a lot of credibility goes to Ken Burns and, his stories about Civil War, baseball, kind of these long form documentaries. And he when he approached Vietnam, Kent State was only going to be a small piece of his piece, during the 70s. And I guess he went to Kent and really got, like, immersed in all of it and really understood, the impact. And so if you check out the PBS documentary by Ken Burns, Vietnam, there's, like, a very, very accurate representation of, like, its whole impact in that era. And, like, he brings up in there that even after the shootings at Kent State, murders, shootings, however it wants to be defined, that 58% of Americans still blame the students.
Well, which we know with the Portage County Grand Jury report.
So, and then also you look at Nixon winning the 1972 election. In Ohio, he won Ohio by, like, by a large margin.
Well, the only one.
And it's like,
we're in the only state that voted for McGovern.
Yeah.
Massachusetts.
So it's like, students are killed in Ohio. Over 50% of the United States believes it was the students' fault. And Nixon still won the election in 1972 and won Ohio, which is like a battleground state usually. And, by a large margin. So, that shows that, like, at the time, people were saying, like, these rebel rousers, these, students that, these liberals, these, communist sympathizers, that was, like, the era of, putting blame on the younger generation. Yeah. I don't want to, like, make large generalities, but, these hippie kids, what are they doing?
Right.
So,
well, I think, if you look at the President's Commission on Campus Unrest, they say it's the most divided time in American history since the Civil War. Some people ask me, well, how does it compare to now? Totally different in terms of a lot of ways. But when you think about that particular time, and you think about your hometown, I remember going, and initially the reason I went was I was working on the Daily Illini, which was the Illinois paper. Came across The Wire, which of course we didn't, it was like a wire. And the more I read about Bill Schroeder, the more I read about all these people, Bill Schroeder as that, and I remember reading that's when I took off and went to Kent.
From this article,
from the article,
Bill Schroeder.
He was there just making up his mind and started getting to know all the parents. And the more you learned about what these kids were really about. I mean, he was an ROTC honor student, going to have to go and fight. And then you see how he's portrayed. I mean, the one thing that I remember talking to his mother, and of course I did a play afterwards called Kent State a Requiem. After he was killed, Mr. Schroeder, a very conservative Republican, they voted for Nixon, they kept getting phone calls. And somebody would say, is Bill there? And the first time he said, well, I don't know, but my son was killed at Kent. I'm sorry that you didn't know that. And then finally, and luckily, he was getting the calls, but not Florence. He said, the person would say, he's not dead, he's alive. And then they would hang up. But so finally, Mr. Schroeder said, well, where is he if he's not dead? And they gave him an address. So he's in Lorain, Ohio. He drives to this address in Cleveland, and it's the communist headquarters. So And then they showed me batches, hundreds of letters where people would write them a note that your son was nothing but a riot, destructive, loving communist who deserved what they got, sign their names. And you're just thinking, talk about hate. It's one thing to approve, but then to sit down and write it. Your grandfather was someone, Pete, who was very, very close to Governor Rhodes. And he was an invaluable source and a wonderful friend who unfortunately passed away. But he was so good at giving me a better understanding of what it was like, the town gown rift, et cetera. Can you share a little bit of his thoughts?
Yeah, so just as like a background, I think too we kind of talk about the destiny of the Kent State family and how kind of we all find each other in like weird ways. So you had a student in like the late 90s, Adam Shoup.
Adam Shoup was in an advocacy and argument class.
And his grandfather was Seabury Ford.
Who he told me afterwards, after I'd said that Seabury Ford was head of the Portage County Grand Jury report, he was a litigant, and he had a birthday the day that they released the report. And to show you how biased, if you read the Portage County Grand Jury report, it was so biased that an upper court ordered it to be burned on the steps, literally burned on the steps. But the Adam, who didn't tell me G. Seabury Ford was my grandfather, he's the one who started the website. And he also, he revealed that his grandfather, on the day that the report was issued, had a birthday. And on the birthday cake said to this 73-year-old, shoot the bastards. And he was very, very happy because he looked at everybody there as an enemy. These were communists from Cuba, et cetera. So,
yeah, and Seabury Ford, he was a colleague in the Republican Party with my grandfather. So,
yes.
My grandpa was one of the barbers in the town of Kent, was one of the youngest individuals in the 50s to ever be on council. And just kind of to give a context of, that the political ideology of the area, you have, Kent and Akron, which are, I think, two of the largest universities, D1 universities that are closest. So there's kind of this, and also Akron was a big tire producer union area. So there's kind of like a hotbed of Democratic blue areas. We would always kid with my grandpa, if you were a Democrat, you'd have won more elections, because he lost elections for like state representative and that type of thing. But serving on the Kent City Council and like in Republican positions in Portage County, he was good friends with Seabury Ford. Was appointed to some positions like State Barber Board by Governor Rhodes. So he kind of rolled in those circles, and he would always say, well, that's interesting. You're studying that, that Dr. Payne and I have different opinions on things. And I know one time we were at Ray's having a drink with him.
Wonderful restaurant.
And he said, his Mayor Satram panicked, and that's why the guard came in. And the students, they were a lot of outsiders. They felt bad that the Kent State students were killed, but they blamed it on these rebel rousers. That's what he would always say. There were so many plates from out of town. There were so many, people
busloads from Chicago
that weren't from Kent that were here.
LSD in the water supply.
Yeah, and that was kind of the feeling among those in Kent. So, hearing his perspective was always interesting, and talking to him about that was like, even up until like a year ago, I would mention just like, yeah, so what was that like at Kent State, in 1970? Oh, helicopters were everywhere. He had served in Korea, and he was like, it felt like that the war had come home, and he didn't talk about the war at all.
Yeah, right.
So.
I think what I found in going over to Kent over the years, and you of course knew Glenn Frank. I mean, Glenn Frank was a very...
I didn't know Glenn. I knew Alan.
Okay,
yeah,
Alan. Well,
his son, yeah.
Glenn Frank was, if you know anything about Kent, Glenn Frank was the geology professor. He was conservative Republican who, the day of the shooting, when the students, after they saw what had happened, many of them wanted to confront the guard. And the guard was loading their M1 rifles once more, to load. And Glenn Frank, not a rhetorician, came and gave one of the most impassioned speeches I've ever heard. in which he basically said tearfully, if you don't leave this area, they're going to come in and it's only going to be a slaughter. And had it not been for him doing that, I think there would have been, because General Del Corso and Canterbury both had said, let's reload. But what I find interesting about Kent, Glenn initially thought that I was kind of an outsider. Why are you coming in from Illinois? Why are you studying this? And that whole event changed my life. I was going to law school and then decided to get the master's, then the PhD, which was the first one on Kent. But what I found very interesting as I got to know Glenn more and he retired and talked to his FBI buddies, he became much more left and much more concerned about the truth. And I remember one of the last times we met, he said to me, I said, so how's your book coming along? Which I know they've got it out now. But he basically said, Greg, one thing I've learned since retiring is everything I believed about my country is a lie. And so I think for you, myself, and others who want to continue to look and see what happened that day, there's more for us to look at and dig into. And I think that I know when we started this piece, and I want you to come back, because we're going to, as I said, we're going to have Mary and John back again. They haven't been together at Emerson since 1995. We were the first ones to bring them together. They've never been together at Kent, which I find interesting.
And we did during the pandemic, we had an online conference with them.
Yes,
that we did.
Well attended.
It was very well attended.
Yes,
that was right at 2020.
Right.
That the anniversary, and I think for those of us that are a little younger, that weren't alive during the time, and you say kind of. And I know probably some of our students today are saying, like, what's the point of all this Kent State stuff? Why does it matter? And we always kind of take that look at, like, if you look at history, and you understand it, you start to see the patterns. You start to see things like, in the 60s, there were, defining protesters. Were they like domestic terrorists? Were they, just innocent students? Were they, people that were upset? And we look at today at protests. Even today there was a protest outside.
Right.
I got delayed coming here because of the protests. Protests are an active thing. I was just watching the news earlier, and down in Atlanta, there's a protest going on about Cop City.
Yes.
I'm not sure if the students have seen that. And that's where they're trying to define protesters as domestic terrorists. Some have been charged. Police were shot. And these are the same approaches that, if you look at the Kent State from like a protest rhetoric, power struggle, power dynamic, it's all the same. You hate to say, we need to learn about history so it doesn't repeat itself.
Santana said that, yeah.
Yeah. But, it's all too, it happens all too much. So, looking back upon these events that were so significant, as a part of our history, we're going to try and get better. And that's, I think the hope of like the generations,
Mm-hmm.
We hopefully can make things better. Hopefully we can progress our agendas forward, make things more understanding. It's not going to be like an overnight thing. But yeah, what's your perspective on that? Yeah.
I mean, my view is people at times will say, why do you keep teaching this? Well, I teach it for no other reason than it needs to be taught. And I used to think, okay, I'm done with this. But then I've discovered, whether it be Linda Moore as my provost at Emerson, who was Carl Moore's ex-wife, and Carl Moore was a significant figure at Kent, or Lou Casella, who was Bill Schroeder's roommate, suddenly interviewing at Emerson. There is something that can or Pete Hall coming in with your grandfather. There's all, Alan Shoup, there's always someone from Kent that's telling me there's something more to do. I think the real piece of it is, as you said, what you call someone, what you label someone. Were they protesters? Were they patriots? Were they rioters? The essence of what Emerson's done since 1880 is telling stories. So the words you choose, according to Richard Weaver, we're not going to get too theoretical here, the words you choose are the behavioral directives. So if I tell you, tell the guard, tell the police that we've got a group of, as you say, domestic terrorists out there, I would assume that we had a lot of domestic terrorists that caused the Boston Massacre and caused this country to have independence. So I think we need to realize words are the best thing we can do to communicate, but the meaning really lies within each of us. And so the essence of why we talk about Kent State is truly to understand the power of language. And at Emerson, we appreciate language as the most powerful weapon out there. It can be used in a positive way or a negative. And so, Pete, what I'd like to say to you is this is kind of one chapter, and I think it could be like War and Peace, many more to come. We want you to come in for not only my class, which is Tuesday. Anybody who's listening who would like to sit in, please do. What we're doing in that class is we're looking at various interpretations from pro-guard to conspiracy theories to whatever. And if there are new stories and there are new interpretations, we invite people to look at them. We're looking at them from the perspective as what are the facts? Are they verifiable? Are they credible? And I think what we're going to have at the end of the day is students will be better in terms of critical thinkers, which is really what it's all about in terms of the Emerson dialogues that we're trying to promote. And that is respect for all sides and let the facts be the judge in terms of which side is better. So Kent State, because of you, I think we've pushed it forward a bit.
Yeah, and I think, when we, as like a wrap up, you look at the song Ohio and its meaning and, just how Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, took that event, really made that a larger timeless event through song, something that, we can hear today, apply to other things. I think that's the power of music, the power of storytelling, as you said, the power of media, the things that we teach here at Emerson and outside of Emerson, just, living in society, is important to acknowledge those pieces of media. Now media's 10-second clips, 30-second clips, but, looking at kind of broadening out, that's what's important. So,
well, thank you for being on Payne on Politics. What I would say is we used to say over at 21 Commonwealth at the Legacy Campus, when you think of Emerson College, we like to think about that the power of effective communication begins here. Hopefully, we'll be able to deliberate and learn, as you've said, from the history of events like Kent State. Because of Four Dead in Ohio, we can learn it by music. We can learn it by art, and we at Emerson have a lot of creative artists. So if you're listening to this, find ways to, as the song says, express yourself.
And as Crosby, we're looking to remember him this week that he passed away. I'll just read a quote that he said about Ohio. For me, Ohio is a high point of the band, a major point of validation. Though we were reacting to reality, dealing with it on the highest level, we could relevantly, immediately name names and point to the finer things.
Four Dead in Ohio. Thank you, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. Thank you, Pete Hall.
Thank you, Dr. Payne.
All right. Thank you, Payne on Politics. See you soon.